Thank you.
Orders of the day.
Resumption of debate on the question that a joint standing committee on electoral matters be appointed for the term of the 51st Parliament to inquire into and report upon electoral and related matters. Ms Webb.
Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I'll pick up where I left off, where I was speaking of the congruity of the scope of the electoral matters committees from the other jurisdictions, and that as a matter of routine, establishing terms of reference for all three committees in other jurisdictions include the preceding election for that jurisdiction. For example, the current Commonwealth Committee has examined the 2022 federal election, tabling its report on the 27th of November 2023. The New South Wales Committee is currently undertaking its mandated inquiry into the administration of the 2023 New South Wales state election and related matters. And the Victorian Committee is currently in the reporting stage of its routine inquiry into the conduct of the 2022 Victorian state election. Importantly, all these committees have the scope to inquire into other electoral-related matters, either as referred to them by their parliaments or ministers or via own motion. This is a significant attribute stemming from their constitution as standing committees rather than select committees, which tend to have a singular specific inquiry term of reference. Instead, as standing committees established for the term of each parliament invest scope for each committee to continue working on other additional electoral-related briefs pertinent to the community at the time, once their examination of the conduct of the recent election or elections are completed. Some of these inquiries, as examples from those other jurisdictions, Mr President, include the following: the functions and administration of voting centres, voter participation and informal voting, the impact of social media on elections and electoral administration, adequate funding and resourcing of jurisdictions' electoral commissions, accessible voting reforms, public funding of election campaigns, political donations and reforms, and the future conduct of elections operating during times of emergency situations, as well as reviewing and reporting on proposed electoral-related bills, all of which Tasmania could learn and benefit from. Mr President, our national and interstate colleagues have undertaken a wealth of fascinating research and work via the auspices of their respective electoral matters committees. Time restraints prevent me from exploring in detail those extensive examples now, but I do encourage members who are interested that it is certainly worth your while to examine the broad range of matters examined and reported on that are available on those committees' web pages. So, Mr President, members may have recognised some of the characteristics I've highlighted of our other interstate counterparts' respective models within the proposed Tasmanian model. So I'll now turn to address briefly each of the provisions proposed in the motion before us. In Clause 1, it seeks to establish the electoral matters as a standing committee until this current Parliament is dissolved. Recently, this Parliament's standing committees tend to be statutory and established under legislation. For example, our Integrity Committee is established under Section 23 of the Integrity Commission Act 2009, while both Public Works Committee and Public Accounts Committee are established under their own acts, that being the Public Works Committee Act 1914 and the Public Accounts Committee Act 1970, respectively. However, the Tasmanian Parliament does have precedent of former joint standing committees being established via resolution or motion, which were the Joint Standing Committee on Community Development and the Joint Standing Committee on Environment, Resources and Development, last constituted in 2010. Similarly, as mentioned earlier, both the federal and the New South Wales parliaments routinely re-establish their respective electoral matters joint standing committees via resolution or motions. Personally, Mr President, I think it would be a fabulous investment in our democratic infrastructure should Tasmania adopt Victoria's approach by legislating to establish our Electoral Matters Committee as a statutory standing committee, but that is for a future debate down the track. Our focus now is on the current clause, for which, as stated, there is ample precedent. Further, Clause 1A establishes the scope and the potential origin of the proposed committee's work, specifically that relating to the state's electoral legislative architecture and frameworks. This is based upon the New South Wales Joint Standing Committee's terms of reference, which details in a similar format the pertinent acts to be included. It's also consistent with the establishing provisions of the Victorian Electoral Matters Committee under its Parliamentary Committees Act, 2003. Clause 1B makes it clear that while the committee can examine bills deemed relevant, the referral of those bills is to be via either a minister or a majority vote of either chamber. This provision is consistent with the democratic principles of the will of a chamber being respected, as well as the executive via a minister seeking additional consideration and scrutiny of proposed legislation. This point was raised with me in relation to this motion by the member for Murchison, for which I acknowledge and thank her. Clause 2 should be self-explanatory. It's clearly a fundamental function of the proposed committee and is consistent with every other of the 3 interstate committees. The only difference being there is always a but, isn't there, Mr President? The fact that due to our system of annual periodic elections for the Legislative Council, the proposed committee will be expected to conduct more than one specific election examination, the recent Assembly elections and the recent periodic Legislative Council elections. Clause 3 and Clause 4 specify reporting timeframes. Clause 3 specifies should this motion pass both chambers, then the lucky members appointed to the committee will need to provide their report on both this year's March state election and this month's 3 upper house polls by the end of next year, 2025. Both New South Wales and Victoria also stipulate an 18-month reporting timeframe for their respective recent election examination provisions. Commonwealth resolution does not appear to stipulate a reporting timeframe on the examination of the most recent federal election. Clause 4 implements the democratic principle of transparency and openness by ensuring the committee, which is a creature of the entire Parliament, remembers to disclose and report back to our colleagues of the matters it has referred to itself to examine. I stress that this is not about asking for permission to undertake those own motions, but it's about transparency and accountability back to the chamber. This clause is consistent with others implemented within other established committee terms of reference. For example, the Joint House Gender and Equality Committee, which we have just recently voted to re-establish, happily. Clause 5 is self-explanatory and pretty routine. Should the other place move to mirror these provisions, as is convention, then the committee will have a membership of 8, which is on par with Victoria's 9 members. Not surprisingly, the larger federal and New South Wales parliaments have larger committee memberships, with the former having 14 members and the latter 11, interestingly. Mr President, I've covered what the motion does include. However, I also need to touch on what it does not. Members may recall that an initial version of the motion which I circulated for feedback prior to tabling also included in Clause 1 those provisions of the Local Government Act 1993 that relate to the procedures for and conduct of elections for local councillors and the conduct of local government elector polls. Members may have noted also the inclusion of local government elections is consistent with the Victorian Parliament's equivalent standing committee scope. Also, it's clear from the New South Wales Standing Committee's index of tabled reports that it has examined matters relating to that state's local government electoral machinery. It was to my thinking that it was appropriate and consistent to include our local government tier within the proposed committee scope, but strictly only the provisions that relate to the current legislative provisions for the operation and administration of their local council elections and elector polls, in recognition that there isn't any other routine mechanism for oversight of those laws other than the state parliament as a whole, just as there isn't for the electoral laws under which state MPs are elected. For example, when the last Parliament moved to introduce compulsory voting for local government elections, the Minister at the time promised a subsequent review of those reforms, which I'm still not clear has occurred and completed. But, however, as an example, that could have been an appropriate brief for an Electoral Matters Committee to examine as part of its routine business, should the inclusion of local government be part of it. The inclusion of the local government tier in those initial iterations of this motion before us was in no way intended to infer that the Electoral Matters Committee would or should seek to interfere in the daily operations or the conduct of local government elections and councils. However, concerns were raised with me about the inclusion of local government within the scope of this proposed committee, particularly in the absence of consultation with local council stakeholders prior to debate. So I've taken on board those legitimate concerns, and hence the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, as proposed under the motion before us, does not include automatic scrutiny of those election-related provisions of the Local Government Act 1993. It may be a matter that the committee wishes to address down the track. Mr President, It's worth taking a moment to clarify the role of the Tasmanian Electoral Commission within the context of the proposed Joint Standing Committee. As I stated earlier, this call for an Electoral Matters Committee does not indicate any doubt over the results of our elections, nor does it, or should it, seek to undermine the role and the work of the Tasmanian Electoral Commission. All the other interstate jurisdictions with established Electoral Matters Joint Committees also have their own electoral commissions. We are all familiar with the Australian Electoral Commission, the AEC. Both New South Wales and Victoria have their own respective electoral commissions at a state level. As we all know, the Electoral Commission is a statutory, independent and impartial body. It is responsible for the conduct of the elections of both houses of this Parliament, as well as local government elections, other statutory elections and the implementation of electoral boundary redistributions. While it's quite standard for the TEC to be a participant in inquiries by making formal representations to relevant parliamentary review, it is not the role of the TEC to undertake inquiries into the full range of matters that may arise as questions, concerns, modernising suggestions or legislative amendments relating to the conduct of elections. For example, the TEC made a submission to the previous Liberal government 2018 review into the Tasmanian Electoral Act 2004, both in 2018 and again in response to that review's interim report in 2019. The TEC also made submissions to the recent electoral funding and disclosure bills. Yet, in contrast, it would not be within the TEC's role to fully examine the political decisions and ramifications surrounding the circumstances of elections, such as the choice to hold concurrent elections in 2021, which I mentioned earlier. Most members, Mr President, will be familiar with the election reports issued by the TEC, which provide valuable data and practical insights after each election. However, it's beyond the scope of the TEC to hold public hearings, to receive public submissions, or to examine current or proposed policy changes. These latter roles are the functions of the proposed parliamentary committee, which would also examine, as part of it, the TEC's reports. The AEC provided a written submission to and appeared before the most recent Commonwealth Electoral Committee inquiry into the conduct of the 2022 federal election. The New South Wales Electoral Matters Committee received submissions from both the New South Wales Electoral Commission and its Independent Commission Against Corruption into its current routine inquiry of that state's 2023 general election. And both these independent entities have also appeared before the New South Wales Committee during its public hearings held in April and this month. Victoria's Electoral Matters Committee examination of the 2022 state election in that state similarly received submissions from the Victorian Electoral Commission, which also appeared before the committee during the public hearing stage. Clearly, it need not be a matter of either or, but both an independent electoral commission and a parliamentary joint standing committee on electoral matters. It's logical, Mr President, for this committee to be established and commence work as soon as possible after the most recent state election. In this regard, it is consistent with the re-establishment timeframes undertaken by those interstate counterparts. Mr President, it's also timely given this proposed Standing Committee on Electoral Matters is an initiative also called for by many who are interested in these matters, including in the recent publication by the Australia Institute Tasmania, their Democracy Agenda for the 51st Parliament, a report released earlier this month. Establishment of this Joint Standing Committee would fulfil Recommendation 5 of that report, which reads, and I quote, immediately establish a Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters to enable enhanced scrutiny of the administration of all Tasmanian elections, consideration of potential new electoral reforms, and put impetus behind promised electoral reforms that have faltered. To conclude, Mr President, I wish to thank members for their constructive feedback and engagement with this proposal, which has resulted in the refined motion currently before us. I do believe the current text reflects those discussions undertaken in good faith, and if passed, the resulting committee will reap the benefit of cooperative goodwill from all political perspectives represented in the 51st Parliament. To reiterate, this motion does not present a radical or subversive idea. Indeed, as we can see in the routine and established practices of some of our interstate counterparts, including governments led by former Prime Minister John Howard through to current Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, all have voted during each commencement stage of their respective parliaments to reconvene their standing committees, with the responsibility of reviewing the election that was just held, which delivered their victory, and other associated electoral-related matters. Similarly, so do newly elected state governments in at least 2 interstate jurisdictions. Each of those new governments participate, along with their political opponents, in their respective parliamentary reviews of election practices, along with their respective electoral commissions, other stakeholders and members of the public, as a matter of course. It's my firm hope that we here now will establish the precedent for this routine democracy health check to be established at the commencement of every new parliament on behalf of the Tasmanian citizens. Just as we systematically move to re-establish joint standing committees on integrity, public works, public accounts, for example, it will be a consistent move to also re-establish a joint standing committee on electoral matters. I can't guarantee that outcome, Mr President, but I just foreshadow it as a positive move here if that was to occur. But before such a committee can become a routine practice within our parliamentary fabric, it requires one parliament, and hopefully that will be this one, to take the plunge in good faith to establish a new and modernising precedent consistent with the Code of Conduct principles we all promise to uphold. This motion, seeking to establish the first joint standing committee on electoral matters for the Tasmanian Parliament, provides that groundbreaking vehicle. It offers us an historic opportunity to forge that legacy, and I commend the motion to the House.